Hello there, Sir from 17 once again. This is more Dark Souls PvP on the Prepare to Die edition with the Quality of Life mod from McRudy. This is going to be a showcase that I'm calling Shatter the Bone, and it is going to be a bunch of fights involving a very low and very slow build. And I'm calling him low and slow because you could barbecue by the time it takes this build to attack. And in these sequences there are two builds that are being fused together from the same session. The first one is, as you can see right now, it is a pickaxe build on a character that I'm testing some viabilities out and some interesting things. You'll have to excuse me at the beginning here, I took a ring off to do something and forgot to put it back on, so I have 0 poise, and as you can imagine, it's not a good idea unless that's what you're trying to do. But this is about strength weapons, or it will be when you see the strength side of the showcase. And these matches here are from a session where I pretty much got battered. Most of these fights will be the times when the build worked, and it represents what the build does. But I want to talk about the viability of strength, coming from the perspective of a very old Martyr's Brigade quote, which you might remember, which was, why would you use dexterity when you can use strength? Anybody remember that video? It was a great video. And at the time, in context, it worked really well, because what Martyr's was trying to say is that a lot of people in Dark Souls just use katanas, and I forgot to put my dragon's blood on, so I died. GG to that one. Here is the strength building question, and you get used to seeing that because that's one of the weaknesses we're going to be addressing and talking about. So the idea is, he made that commentary to spark diversity in a community that was katana obsessed. Katanas, dartwood grain rings. And the irony of this conversation is that is almost exactly what I am fighting right now. And this particular session, we didn't know what builds we were going to be using. It wasn't like this player intentionally counterpicked me. But this is, give or take it, one of the hardest setups you could come across. Because, as you can see here, the washing pole is a katana, it has all the strengths of the katana, but it has one weakness, which is it's quite slow compared to them. However, that weakness is changed and turned into somewhat of a strength because it has increased range. And that leads you to having a very capable weapon with a lot of phantom range. So we have this powerful setup, and we have the dartwood grain ring as well. And then you'll notice on the offhand this player has a parrying dagger, which is a very good implement for getting parries. And because strength weapons swing so slowly, they are some of the easiest weapons to parry just visually because of the length of the animation. When you combine all of these things together, you have a very interesting predicament. And at the time, as I've mentioned, Martyr said this in order to elicit a response from the community so that people would go forth and do different things and come up with more creative builds. And when he said that, if you watch that video, you'll notice that he's using a mixture of weapons, a mixture of setups, and he has a lot of success, and he has a lot of fun because that was his style. But if you analyse that video critically, the first thing which he mentions himself, which is a bit of an omission, is that he's using a bow, which takes dexterity, which changes the range problems of the strength weapons, because strength weapons are very strong. They have tons of damage, they have tons of stun, but they are slow and they do not have range. And if they do have range, you're either getting lucky or using very specific movesets. So it leads you to a circumstance of you are trapped in your engagement distances and in what you want to do unless you can come up with very creative solutions. And in this session, I was trying to come up with some solutions and it was very hard. And it led to a very frustrating time. But here's the kicker. If you're frustrated in a session, it means your opponent is doing something correct. They're doing something right, and it's the impetus on you to try to understand why you're frustrated and how to fight it. And that is where strength weapons become a huge test of patience and a big test of skill as well. Because in this particular scenario, I have to hit this guy in order to see any kind of success. But I can't hit him. And what do you do with all this power and all of this raw energy if you can't connect? And then when you combine it with the idea of you have to overextend to get in there and try and win, but you can't hit them, so it forces you to overextend even more, and then when you overextend, you might get parried. So it's this very tenuous balance of circumstances, and it leads you to the universal answer in Dark Souls, which is an answer we all know, but some of us aren't always the most willing to enable on every encounter, which is the solution to my problems is to backstab. And in this footage, you'll see me do it a lot. And what happened in the beginning of our set is I was trying to land anything I could, and I really couldn't. So then I started to threaten for backstabs, because what happens when you backstab someone is you knock them down. When you knock them down, they have to scramble, and in that scramble, I can maybe take advantage of what they choose to do. When you're on a fast build using the Darkwood Grain Ring, you tend to roll a lot. You tend to roll recklessly. So if I can knock you down, I can then play the mind game of trying to guess where you're going to go and try to intercept you. And this can lead to a few things. This can lead to me getting you with a backstab, this can lead to me hitting you and then stun locking you, this can just downright lead to me winning. But it's also problematic, because in that video where Martyrs was doing, you know, why would you use dexterity when you can use strength, even though he had the bow on, even though he was using some dexterity weapons technically, if you want to be really pedantic, which we won't be because we love Martyrs. In that video, he was up against pretty average players. Players who didn't really know what setup parries were, didn't really know how to counter backstab, didn't really know a lot of the things that players can know in this game. And the guy I'm fighting right now is a skilled player. He might not be the best, but he's certainly not the worst. And he is adjusting his strategies, he is changing what he does based upon what I do, and he is being very effective with his toolset. And his toolset is very strong. So when we say things like, why would you do X when you can do Y? There are so many reasons for this conversation to get convoluted. And of course, in its purest level, that original video was to spark debate and to spark creativity. And that's the way I took it at the time. But all these years later, when I was on this build that you're watching here, which if you're wondering, it's a pure strength pretty much. It's got an absurd amount of strength, and because I wanted to make it a Chloranthy build so I could move really quickly, it's also got an absurd amount of endurance as well. And the secret that this build had is at any moment I could have put the Darkwood Grain Ring on myself and used it, but it wouldn't have helped my problems. My problems stemmed from my inability to hit him. It wasn't my inability to get away a lot of the times, although I do have lots of recovery, like just then. And a good player is going to punish that, because that's how it works. And this build was meant to solely focus on this big axe. And if you watch the montage I put up recently, you'll see me doing some shenanigans with some big weapons in some free-for-alls. That build that you just saw then, that guy was designed to cause chaos with multiple opponents. So when I come into a dueling situation like this, it showcases a lot of the weaknesses of that build and a lot of the problems I didn't realise that it had. So it was super useful for that. And it was, how do you find a solution to things where the solution is obvious, but you don't want to choose it? Because you'll hear me talk about backstabs a lot in these sessions, guys, and you'll see it from a perspective of, I like backstabs when they are a tool to punish something and they are cool. I'm not a big fan of backstabs when that's all the game becomes. And I'm like that with lots of mechanics, and of course, the one thing you need to take away from if you've ever played these games, or if you ever got into them, or if you're intending to, is that there are no rules in Souls games. They were never meant to work, you know? They never anticipated that people were going to do this with Demon Souls, and that those players would come into Dark Souls and do it even more and inspire even more people. So it stems into the situation of, we have turned this into a game that it potentially never was meant to be. So expecting it to play under our own values and our strange obsessions is just unrealistic at best. So the only rule you need to focus on when you're playing, when you're building your build, and when you're fighting, is that there are no rules. Expect everything. But yet, in spite of me knowing this, and in spite of me enforcing this, I still find myself wanting it to be different. Which is the eternal conversation, isn't it? And it's such a strange psychological battle against yourself. I love parries when they're clutch and when they're cool, but I hate them when they're all the time and they're spammed. It pisses me off something into high heaven seeing somebody repeatedly go for parries, because it just doesn't mean anything to me in the end. But does that mean you shouldn't do it? Absolutely not. And it's the same with anything, isn't it? Like, think about stun locks. Stun locks can be really useful. They can lead to lots of mind games, they can lead to lots of situations that can help you to win. But if you're constantly getting stun locked, it gets really frustrating. In a stun lock situation, there's ways out of it, like just then, did you see him toggle? He got out of the toggle just then to get around my axe. And that was one of the things that he wasn't doing that he could have been doing a lot more. In this session, you'll notice that when I do land and I go for more hits, a lot of the times he lets me hit him. And in those moments, if he'd have been sharper on his toggles, he would have been able to get out. He could have turned it into a bad situation. And there is a fight. I don't know if you've seen it yet. Oh, there it was, just then. Did you see what he did, guys? That's what he could have been doing the whole fight if he wanted to. It's just maybe he didn't think of it that way, or maybe he was just like I am a lot of the times where I just forget to do it. I get lazy. I have to wake it up sometimes. And for the people that missed what happened, I stunned him, he toggled, and then he backstabbed me, which is a super big danger. And in our session together, when he showed me this, because this was quite early on in the session, or middle into halfway through maybe, as soon as he represented the threat of him stun locking, I all of a sudden got scared to hit him multiple times. But it just so happened that he never did it again. That was the only time he did it. He showed it to me, and it instilled me with doubt, but it didn't have a huge effect on the fight, because he continued to just do different things. And for the most, I think there were only a few things that I noticed him doing as far as patterns which could have got him killed. And at the time, I didn't want to capitalise on too many of them because, again, I don't think it makes for the most exciting video when you just go to something really reliable when you see it. And this right here was interesting because you'll notice he's trying to either bleed me out here or just keep me off him. And he'd never done this, so this was really cool. And in this moment, I knew the parry was coming, so I popped the pickaxe on to try and get some damage, but I'm really cognizant of the bleed. And I don't know if he thought I was going for backstabs because I was backstabbing a lot, but because he was aggressive, it opened the door for me to parry. And in our session, I didn't really want to parry because I wanted to focus on the strength weapons, but every so often, you have to represent that threat. Just like the combustion just then. You have to show them that you're willing to do it. And right here, because he swapped to the parrying dagger, I sprinted around and backstabbed him. At this point in our session, whenever he put that dagger on, he pretty much parried me. So there was no qualms about it towards the end. I didn't even want to swing, I would just go for his back every time. And this here is me swapping to the greatsword. These clips don't count as much in my eyes because this sword has got some really good useful tools. It's still really slow, but compared to the axe is where all the interesting play is for me, because it's so difficult to use. And if you're just invading someone who doesn't know the game, you can probably just bait them into something and then really punish them with the axe. But if you're up against someone who's thinking, who's changing, who's adapting, and who's using very capable tools, then it becomes... And there's a backstab coming up there. Or maybe not. I thought he caught me then on that side roll. But here's another close match. We're both one hit away from death, and he has the faster weapon. And there it is. And I just get the poke a little bit too late. That's one of the big strengths of the washing pole as well. The washing pole has so much phantom range. And it makes sense, it's a huge weapon, isn't it? And it's a lot slower than a standard katana, so it pays for it. But there were times when you're getting hit and you're just like, Jesus, I can't get away from it. And just here, one of those patterns that I noticed with this player, he liked to put the parrying dagger on, slash once, and then parry. And he did it a ton. So whenever he popped it on, at this part, because this was the end of our session, if you see the clips with the pickaxe, this was the end, I would always try to circle around and stab him in the back. I'd learnt my lesson at that point, and I'd tried to challenge it in several ways, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. Because if you're wondering about parries, guys, when somebody wants to parry, like, look at this. Parrying like this is... Eventually you're going to get caught, and I would have died if he'd have parried me. But luckily, at that distance with the spear, it's really hard to do. And if you're fighting someone who parries a lot and you are struggling, you can use unblockable weapons, you can use unblockable moves, you can use jump attacks. But one of the things I noticed, early on I tried to land a lot of jump attacks when I thought parries were coming, and I would do a jumping axe and it would be bang on him, but it wouldn't hit. And in those situations where you need it to hit and it won't, it feels really demoralising. And then when you add the Darkwood Grain Ring as well, like, you won't see the footage because it's not here. I trimmed it out. I didn't want this to be too long. But there is footage of rounds where he bullied me and I never touched him once. And I swung maybe 50 times. And I'm not even joking, that sounds like hyperbole, it's not. I was doing swings to make him come in and then trying to punch him when he came in, and he'd just come in and then flip out and then hit me and then flip out, and it was just, you were bleeding the whole time. And if you watch that video that inspired me to go full hog with this dedicated strength guy in a 1v1 against arguably one of the biggest nightmares I could have imagined in the tool set that I had to fight against a confident player, you'll notice that the stuff Martyrs is using is really fast. Like, he's using a mace. Maces are fucking great, dude. Maces are a stun machine. They're mad fast. They've got a whiff on instability, but that thing is good. And then he's using the Gravelord sword, which is a great curve sword, which is a dex weapon, even though the scaling's kind of trash. And he does explain this in the video. Again, no shade to Martyr. But it's easy to say that strength is better than dexterity in a video like that when you're using some of the safest of those weapons. And then later on, if you watch that series a bit longer, he does pull out some of the bigger ones, some of the slower ones, and he even manages to land the special R2 on the Guardian's hammer axe thing, which is the holy grail. I've yet to land that, but that was a beautiful clip in his series. And when he starts using those, it does become a bit more of that dance of how do you fight against someone when you're using these incredibly slow weapons and they're using very capable tools. That right there, by the way, guys, is I don't generally like to chain unless it's a good read. I tried to kick him then, and I ended up getting the option select into the backstab, so I'm sorry about that, but sometimes it happens. And it is a good strategy to go for, it's just not something I like to do. But another thing that I have with that video is something that came down to here. I was talking to this guy as we were playing every so often, and I mentioned to him that I really didn't want to parry when I was using this axe. You'll notice I'm on a crystal great axe now. Halfway through our session, because I couldn't land anything, I put the crystal great axe on to try and see how much damage I could get with that. You can see my stats as well. And there's a couple of moments where I got some weird dropped inputs. Have you ever seen me standing still when I'm on wake up? Sometimes I'm doing that for strategy, but other times I tried to do something and it didn't buffer it, which was really weird. We got some odd lag in this session. Doesn't excuse wins or losses, doesn't change anything, but it was weird. And what happened is when I put the crystal one on, it does do more damage, obviously, but it still really didn't matter. Like, this thing hurts anyway. It's a very damaging weapon. And if I get a parry, I do like 1,000 damage. It's obscene, you know? But as I was saying before I got kind of tangented off, I said that I didn't want to use parries to this player. Because to me, if you're using parries, you're not really using the build. And that's not to say that you shouldn't use parries. Parries are part of the game. Absolutely use them. But what I meant was, to me, if I'm going to focus on strength, I want to focus on the pureness of swinging something slow and having to learn when to swing it. Learning those timings, learning that spacing. This was a really silly fight, this one, because at this stage in our encounters, he'd realised I was defending on the parries by changing into giants. So he tried to trap me in giants and capitalise on it, but I had so much poise I could just swing like a moron the whole time, and it became even more dangerous. And right there, that's one of the reasons why rolling forwards can be very dangerous. Punishing a forward roll like that is insane. But again, I can't catch him. I can't catch him, and it leads to these moments of right there. I do an R2, and then boom, I get punished for it. And it turns it into a maze that you have to solve. It's this riddle. When can I swing when I can never swing? It's such a difficult mentality. And I want to put some closing thoughts on this. GG to the session and to that set. And GG to that video talking about why would you use dexterity when you can use strength. But I would argue a better title for that video should have been, why would you use dexterity when you can buckler? Because if you watch that series, guys, watch how many times Martyrs parries. He parries a lot in that series. And parrying is a universal equalizer, and it's easily the strongest thing in the game. Between backstabs and parries, those two mechanics can take any build and enable you to win. But where do we go from this? Well, here's where we go, guys. That session was so elucidating to me that I went back in and I changed a bunch of things. The first one was, I wanted to use Chloranthy because I thought I could be a high-flying Great Axe user and I could be constantly rolling and swinging and making it really exciting. That player taught me in that session that no matter how much stamina I have, I will never be able to chase a Darkwood Grainring Katana. It's just not going to happen if they're even remotely skilled. So that's something I took away from it. And what I did is I went in and I dropped the Chloranthy ring. Because of that Chloranthy ring, I had invested something like 45 points, 45 levels in endurance to let me roll with that setup. I swapped it to Havel's. I put those points into my HP, so I've got a bit more life, because my HP was on the low side for some really competitive fights. And then I gave myself a little bit of dexterity. Because one of the things I noticed in our sequence that was really frustrating is I couldn't kick into anything. Kicking into an R1 with this weapon could lead to me getting parried, it's that bloody slow. Kicking into R2 was the same. Kicking into mix-up was good, because then I can try and backstab, chase him down, try and hit him, try and do a jump attack, try and be ambiguous, try and do a lot of things, maybe even try to bait him to do something in response and then parry him and so on and so forth. But I can do that with any kick, I don't need a weapon for that. So because I couldn't kick into a threat, because I didn't have anything fast enough, and because I couldn't catch a lot of the times when he rolled in and I knew I could get him and I tried and I missed, I went with something faster in my offhand. So now the build has got a little bit of dexterity, just like good old Martyr's Brigade on his strength build. And we've added a faster curved sword for those occasional catches and occasional moments to threaten, for both feints and for roll catches and for maybe some pressure after a kick. And hopefully, the next time I wield the low and slow barbecue build, I will have more success in enforcing my will and shattering the bone.